welcome to First Look, a Bible study looking ahead to the reading or readings for the coming Sunday. My name is Carl, and it's really good to have you with us. This week we're exploring a block of Jesus' teaching in which he challenges the Pharisees and Scribes about their religious practice. Before we dive into this, however, if you've not done so already, you may find it useful to download the sheet that accompanies this study, and you'll find the link for that in the video description in YouTube. On the sheet you will find the text of today's reading, some other passages you may wish to look up, the questions we'll be considering together later on, and lots of room for you to record your own thoughts and observations. So then, without further ado, let's dive into this week's text, which comes from Matthew's Gospel, chapter 23, verses 1 to 12. We continue to find ourselves in the early part of Holy Week, and Jesus was in the Jerusalem temple courtyard teaching the large crowds that had gathered there. And as we see in chapter 21, verse 23 through to chapter 22 verse 46, he'd been involved in a series of disputes as the Pharisees and Scribes posed various questions, and as did the chief priests and the elders and some of the Sadducees and even some of the Herodians, all trying to trip Jesus up, to entrap him. But that had all ended with Jesus not only responding to their questions, but posing a question of his own at the end of chapter 22 that it seems pulled his would-be interrogators up short. And now in what follows in chapter 23, running throughout it, so from verses 1 to 39, Jesus starts to be able to make statements really of his own, until at the end of chapter 23 he comes to a conclusion in that, and as we hear in verse 1 of chapter 24, sets out from the temple back to his overnight accommodation. So this forms part, some scholars argue, of one of 5 blocks of Jesus' teaching that we find within Matthew's Gospel. Some question whether it can really be paired with the apocalyptic discourse of Matthew 24, whether it makes sense to treat that as one unit or not. But either way, it seems that within all of this, the figure of Moses features very, very heavily, and Jesus being cast as the new Moses perhaps does make more sense if we view this as part of one of Matthew's 5 blocks of teaching, mirroring the 5 books of the Torah, the law of Moses. Now in this passage, we've got Jesus, who was coming to the end not just of his public ministry, but of his earthly life. And the crowds, we're told, who were gathered there, saw Jesus very much as a prophet, and were cheering him on, it seems, against other Jewish religious authority figures. Those who are named in this section are the Pharisees and the Scribes. Now, the Pharisees were part of one of the major groups within the lively Judaism of the day, and they placed a great deal of emphasis both on the oral laws that were trying to interpret the law of Moses and apply it to different aspects of everyday life, and on to holiness, being set apart. And listening to all of this, you continue to have the large crowds, who would have been made up not just of residents of Jerusalem, but given the timing of things, people who were Passover pilgrims who had come to the city specifically to celebrate that festival. Now we know that Matthew's Gospel was the second of the canonical Gospels to be written, probably around 75 to 80 of the Common Era. It is the most overtly grounded in what we now call Second Temple Judaism, and it was written to a predominantly, though not wholly, Jewish community, which influences a lot of how things are presented, I think. It also was written, therefore, after the Romans had destroyed the Jerusalem temple in the year 70, leading to a real crisis among the Jewish people about, well, what does it mean to be God's people, given that that has happened? And I think the narrative of conflict between Jesus and other religious leaders is, at least in part, shaped by the context facing Matthew's faith community. As Matthew's community was the second one to have a gospel written for them, we might want to look back to the sort of first version of at least part of what's going on here in Mark, in chapter 12, verses 38 to 40. That snippet there seems to be fleshed out in Matthew 23. And we might want to look to the third gospel, to Luke, to chapter 11, verses 37 to 52, because therein we find a lot of similar material, similar themes and ideas being worked out. Now, as I've already said, I'm reasonably persuaded that this passage in Matthew 23, form one of the 5 blocks of teaching mirroring the 5 books of the Torah found within Matthew's Gospel, and sets Jesus up as the new Moses, as the successor to Moses, but this time one who will take the people not just to the threshold of the promised land, but into it, mirroring the role also of Joshua, his namesake. Jesus and Joshua are the same word. Now, there's some debate when we look at verse 2 of today's passage as to what the seat of Moses, or in the Greek cathedra, might actually refer to. Some argue that it's figurative, that it points to the authority with which the Pharisees and the Scribes spoke. Others argue that it might be literal and refer to seats that they would sit on to teach within the synagogues and schools of Israel. Either way, we know in the first part of verse 3, Jesus tells people to follow what the Pharisees and Scribes are doing because they sit in the seat of Moses. And in trying to argue that, he indeed quotes Moses from Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 10. But he goes on in the next part of that verse to say, but they don't always behave as they should. They don't always practice what they preach, don't always behave in a way that is themselves consistent with the law of Moses. And hence, Jesus is not, I think, attacking the kind of rabbinic ideal, the method of rabbinic teaching, or even attacking the law of Moses itself, as some have argued at different points in time, but actually pointing out that the Pharisees and Scribes are not actually the models of good practice that they like to believe themselves to be, because they don't practice what they preach. The emphasis on making sure that words and actions match up was a key theme within the rabbinic tradition, and Jesus was not alone in wanting to emphasize this. The next section of the passage for today covers verses 4 to 7. The reference in verse 4 to heavy burdens, heavy loads, refers to the yoke that one would take upon oneself, the yoke of God's law, the Torah. And having lots of precise stipulations about how to put this law into practice in everyday life, in other words, carrying a heavy spiritual burden, was sometimes seen as virtuous. But the risk, and we've already heard this when we think about Jesus summing up what's at the heart of the law of Moses in chapter 22, verses 34 to 40. The risk with this is that the heart of the law, why it's there, gets lost amid all of those additional layers of interpretation. The risk is, I suppose, in other words, that we end up not being able to see the wood for the trees. With having too many stipulations, we lose the spirit of what's intended. We might contrast the heavy burden that Jesus talks about the Pharisees and the Scribes placing upon people with what we find in chapter 11, verses 28 to 30, when Jesus invites people to come and find rest in him because his yoke is easy and his burden is light. Now in verse 5, when reference is made to the outward piety of the Pharisees and Scribes, we may recall what Jesus has already said in the Sermon on the Mount, and specifically chapter 6, verses 1 to 18. This seems to be a kind of potted summary of what is more elaborated in that earlier part of Matthew's Gospel. And Jesus describes the Pharisees and Scribes as wearing Jewish prayer outfits, but as exaggeratedly as they could get away with. The phylacteries were prayer boxes, if you will, and they contained scrolls from the Hebrew scriptures, like, for example, Exodus chapter 13, verses 1 to 16. And during morning prayer, they were worn on the forehead and on the arm. And there were fringes and tassels that were tied around the corners of outer garments of a prayer shawl. And that was to remind people of the need to observe God's commandments, taking us back to Numbers 15, verses 38 and 39. It was what Jewish men would wear to go and pray. But Jesus is making the point here, not somehow saying these things are bad, but that the Pharisees and the Scribes are wearing them in an exaggerated way to draw attention to their own sense of holiness. His critique of their status seeking that we find in verses 6 and 7 also agrees with what other rabbis, other rabbinic leaders were saying at that time. The Pharisees and Scribes were as much political and social leaders as they were religious in that society where faith and politics were not separate but very much intertwined. And so what's going on here is not only about religious status, but it's also about politics, it's about power dynamics. And so when Jesus is questioning the sort of ostentatious religious dress, he's critiquing the kind of claims to political power that are being made as much as how things relate to God. Now we need to keep in mind in verse 8, when Jesus talks about those who like to be called rabbi, that to call someone rabbi in that world was a bit like calling them sir or madam today. It was a mark of respect. And in the Gospels, it's used as an equivalent word at times for teacher. So some Bible translations will sometimes refer to Jesus as teacher, some as rabbi. It's the same basic point. Some of the rabbis we know liked to be referred to as father or as master. But Jesus makes the point in verses 8 to 10 that actually it's only God and him as God incarnate, as fully God and fully human, who are really able to bear these titles. Father points to Father in heaven. And Jesus is, I think, arguably putting forward an egalitarian, a kind of anti-hierarchical stance here by challenging the kind of wanting to lord it over people, if you will. Now we know in the New Testament, specifically if we look at Ephesians chapter 4 verse 11, say, that there are a variety of titles that are used for leaders. And it's quite possible to still lord it over other people, still indulge in these power games, while eschewing formal titles. And so what really matters is the key underpinning principles, the humble principles of verses 11 and 12. This really gets to the heart of what Jesus has been saying as he highlights these gospel reversals and challenges, I think, the Pharisees and Scribes to actually enact them. He'd made a similar set of claims back in chapter 20, verses 24 to 28, when he was dealing with his own disciples, arguing about who was the greatest, and some of them seeking exalted status. The upside-down values of the kingdom of God are really laid bare in this section. But this time, instead of just being aimed at the disciples, Jesus is saying these things far more publicly and challenging others as he's challenged his own friends. The wider context that this comes in the middle of Holy Week, as we now call it, is very important, because it shows us that Jesus was not just saying these things, but actually doing them, and would be humbled himself as a few days' time when he was naked and helpless, nailed to the cross, embracing our broken world in love. And so we might think, as we read this whole section of Paul's beautiful poem in Philippians chapter 2, verses 5 to 11, because in many ways the same point is being made. So this is a challenging text, there's no doubt about it. And it's one that poses a real challenge to us. Do we walk the talk in our lives? But also one that does need some careful handling, because it has been used to attack Jewish beliefs and Jewish people. We've got to remember that Jesus himself was a faithful Jew, and that what we find here is an argument about how best to practice that faith, not a rejection of Judaism and of God's relationship with the Jewish people. So with that note of caution in mind, we now turn to our questions for this week.